My presentation is titled Waste and Communism under the Cold War. It is closely related to my current research project, and what I hope is that this project will be continued as a group research project in the future. We will see the result of the decisions of funding bodies in the coming month. Before I get to waste and communism, I would like to introduce you to the activities that we have in Helsinki on the field of environmental humanities. In recent years, with Mikko Saiko and several other scholars, we have established an environmental humanities hub that you may also check online at the websites of Helsinki University, helsinki.fi/n/research groups/environmental humanities. We also have social media sites, so maybe those are easier to find. And quite a large number of scholars, and many of them are eminent, excellent scholars, are associated with the hub. For example, Parker, who's going to give a talk in the second section of this workshop. And the hub has a mission statement. Actually, Parker was responsible for this project to define who are these people and what do they want. And the mission statement goes as the University of Helsinki Environmental Humanities Hub studies the multifaceted culture and relational discussions of anthropogenic environmental change, which is one of the most pressing challenges that humanity currently faces. And personally, I really like this summary. We organize regular events that used to be called Helsinki Environmental Humanities Forums, but now we changed the name a little bit. Now it's Environmental Humanities Forums via Zoom, because we cannot really invite anyone anymore physically, as we cannot even work at university at the moment. We have to work at home. We have a YouTube channel where you find most of the talks, and some of the names are quite well known. The latest talk was by Borowy from Shanghai University, and we also have my personal favorites are Stephen Brain's talk and Peter Virtanen's talk about indigenous bicultural heritage is very, very stimulating, and Mark Stoll, who is a very well-known scholar on environment and religion. Okay, the goals of this presentation is, I hope by the end of the presentation and discussion, you will understand the Soviet approach towards post-consumer waste under the Cold War better. What is post-consumer waste? Well, it's the waste that is leaving the consumers. And I hope to describe differences and similarities between the Soviet and Western systems of post-consumer waste in the 50s and 70s. And I hope that we will all understand better the formation of the concept of waste, especially the aspects that I'm most interested in, the culture and social factors. Okay. Dirty USSR versus the clean West. The Soviet Union has been often interpreted by social scientists as dirty, as opposed to the clean and superior West when it came to the environment. Despite that consensus, Soviet citizens developed complex repair, reuse, and recycle skills. They transformed, saved, and condensed an amazing variety of foods, consumer objects, and packaging. Well, this has been actually quite typical to many, or I would say most, human societies before the 20th century. And many of the objects and resources that Soviet citizens cared for so much, they existed in a single-use format or were often regarded as trash in the West after the Second World War. So beyond that, I think it's also very important to note that a large portion of these repair, reuse, and recycle activities were managed and carried out by women in the Soviet Union. So that gives a strong gender aspect to the story. What is the consensus? Well, it's quite easy to summarize this. John Robert McNeill, probably, well, one of the most famous environmental humanities scholars in recent decades, who works in Washington, D.C. He wrote a very influential book with Peter Engelke. It was published about 6 years ago, The Great Acceleration, an environmental history of the Anthropocene. And he summarizes the deeds of the socialist regimes as socialist regimes took the correction of nature's mistakes as a duty and put environmental protection near the bottom on their list of priorities. Ideology had much to do with it. Socialist orthodoxy simply defined environmental degradation as a capitalist problem. Pollution occurred under capitalism because profit-maximizing firms foisted their pollution on society as a way to save costs. Soviet theorists maintained that pollution could not exist under socialism. So when I read that, I was like, this is very interesting, because basically this means that I was reading Soviet theorists and Soviet history that is probably not very well known by one of the most important scholars of environmental humanities that are telling quite a different story. Okay. So what John McNeill wrote is basically the consensus of the scientific community. But it's also the consensus that the drastic reduction of consumer waste and shift to circular economy are key to tackle the global environmental crisis. So this is a little bit problematic. If communism was bad and capitalism is good, then how it's possible that suddenly we have this horrible global environmental crisis? And we have to shift the circular economy and the sustainability to solve it, to find solution. The importance of closing loops in industrial ecosystems and minimizing waste by repair, remanufacture, reuse, and recycle are critical. Wow. Such new ideas, revolutionary thoughts. Well, this is exactly what humans did for thousands of years. They repaired, they reused, and they recycled. And it's really great that scientists are reinventing the wheel again, so that we will shift to circular economy and sustainability in the future by repairing, reusing, and recycling. Okay, so we have the task, but we have a problem. Circular schemes work with very low efficiency in most industrialized countries, and these countries make the most waste, as Iris very well explained to us. The contradiction continues. It's also the consensus of the scientific community that liberal democracy is the foundation of effective environmental protection because of citizen participation, because of various stakeholders and actors. It is the consensus of social sciences that authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes cannot really maintain effective environmental protection systems. Yet, the world's richest countries, and most of them are Western liberal democracies, waste more than others. For example, developed countries consume more than 60% of the world's industrial raw materials and only comprise 22% of the world's population. US consumers generate more than any other nation in the world, 2 kilograms of municipal solid waste per person per day. And 55% is contributed as a residential garbage, post-consumer waste. For example, per capita waste generation, OECD countries has increased by 14% since 1990. And 1980, the year where I was born, since then by more than a third, 35%. So as Iris pointed out before my talk, it seems to be growing, the waste production, despite of the efforts that are taken. Okay, I think I just stop for a moment because someone's microphone is on, so I just mute. Yes, Kolubali. I just mute him. Okay. All right. Please keep your microphones muted. Thank you. So what I'm trying to do is challenging the consensus. And I'm not the first one. In 2007, Zsuzsa Gille suggested that it was impossible to see state socialism as dirty and capitalism as clean. According to Gille, the collapse of communism did not improve overall environmental conditions universally. Gille examined waste management practices in Hungary. It's a coincidence that she's also Hungarian, and found that liberal capitalism and privatization led to near environmental catastrophes in the 1990s, after the country has shifted very abruptly, very rapidly to liberal capitalism. Influenced by Gille, partly in 2011, Stephen Brain proposed a new theoretical framework, Stalinist environmentalism. What the heck is that? Brain stated that if environmentalism is defined as the political and philosophical program that seeks to impose limits on human activity so as to preserve the integrity of the environment, then the Soviet Union did indeed pursue environmentalism. Well, you can imagine that this was quite a controversial claim, and there were many scholars who discussed that. Okay, so what about my research? My research aims to further challenge that existing scientific status quo about the dirty USSR, especially, or the dirty East Bloc, communist bloc. It suggests that despite the notorious environmental reputation of the Soviet industrialization and urbanization, some of the Soviet policies and practices fostered a relatively closed system based on domestic repair, reuse, and recycling. So these elements are quite similar to the freshly proposed elements of circular economy that we should aim to reach in the future. My research argues that such Soviet policies and practices are critical. We need to understand them better. In fact, we need to understand all of these practices and policies better. I happen to do research on Soviet Union because they have an ability to contribute to our future shift to sustainability. It's a phrase that history can be used, and lessons from history can contribute to the better understanding of future challenges. But in this case, it looks that it's actually quite a fact, or maybe a fact. All right, so what is the difference between circular and open waste systems? The process of defining trash and the decision of keeping something, keeping an object, or keeping stuff or matter, or dumping it, it's quite a simple decision. You have it or you let it go. But okay, it looks like a very simple decision, or like a very simple process, but it's a result of very complex societal, ethical, cultural, economic, and technological mechanisms. Before the 20th century, human societies reused and recycled widely, and their systems were rather, we would call it now, closed and circular. And it was first the United States that developed a more open system. And this more open system Well, it had its roots in the 19th century, but it became more widespread in the 20th century, before the First World War and especially after the First World War. And by the 1950s, it was a full-blown open system. It was based on factory production, a brief use of goods, so frequent changes, and packaging. And most of these products, most of these goods, when they became waste, when they were thrown, they landed in landfills or incinerators. This is the system that was adopted, this open system. It's called an open system that was adopted globally in many countries, maybe in many of your native countries, via the Americanization of lifestyles and the consumerism of lifestyles. In the Soviet Union, the system of objects, of course, it was not rigid. It was not that it was not changing. For example, Khrushchev initiated a famous chemicalization program that was based on skyrocketing PVC production and other plastics, production of plastics. But this change towards consumerism appeared at a much, much slower rate. And of course, this has a tight connection with the economic and political institutions in the Soviet Union. But the bottom line is that this consumerist change appeared much slower in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe than in the West. However, after 1991, this old, somewhat circular consumer system radically changed, and the consumer culture overtaken urban areas of Russia and also Eastern Europe. And this new consumerism was based on the take, make, waste, extractive industrial model. This model that we just discussed, that is originating from the West. And it's based on the continual influx of new products designed to be used briefly and then thrown away. And today, Russia battles with one of the worst consumer waste crises globally. So this is very interesting to me. Okay. I didn't check the time, Iris. How much time I have left? Just want to check on that.
Well, I didn't check either, but I think I went over time too. So why don't you just finish?
Okay, this is what I will do. Thank you. Yes, Soviet consumers and circularity. The reuse of objects was very widespread in the USSR after the Second World War. For example, the single-use can system that was developed in the West by the 1950s and also adopted in Western Europe after the Second World War was not in use in the Soviet Union. Single-use cans could be purchased abroad, and there were these selected Berezka stores that were reserved for the elite and foreigners. So actually the single-use cans that were considered to be as waste in the West, they became so important, so valued objects that Eastern European households began to use them for home decoration in the 1970s. Imagine this contradiction. Some of the plastic objects, plastic packaging, because they were not universal at all, only very few products were packed in plastics. And here is a Finnish example. The processed cheese, the cream cheese of Viola, that is produced by a Finnish company called Valio. The container, of course, the product was also very popular in the Soviet Union, but the container was praised for its durability and applicability as a recyclable food container. So Soviet consumers are very enthusiastic to use Viola cheese boxes as containers to be recycled. Even today, when you travel to Eastern Europe, you realize that people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, they frequently wash plastic containers and reuse them at home for storing food or transporting food. They do not necessarily buy plastic containers in the store. They just reuse the plastic containers that are now widely available. It's very interesting. Soviet citizens also reused shopping bags, of course, because plastic bags were very rare and treasured. They were like jewelry accessories. So some people, there are these oral stories about plastic bags that they acquired plastic bags from abroad, and on the plastic bag there was a Western brand name, and they kept the bag at home and only used it on special occasions when they were going to the city for a stroll, to show that they have such a high value plastic bag that is, of course, was a single-use product and immediately to be discarded in the West. As opposed to that, Soviet citizens used metal chain bags and textile bags or willow baskets that were used and reused hundreds and thousands of times. My family had a metal chain bag and we were using it, I think, for a decade or so. Yeah. Food is a very great example also for recycling and reusing leftover to save costs. In the Soviet Union, there was a wide array of cooking books and women's magazine tips to give ideas for mostly for Soviet women, how to cook a good leftover meal. But men also participated in repair and reuse, and Soviet men were fixing broken furniture and finding DIY solutions for a wider range of problems, reusing materials and repairing at home. But women did the same. They were replacing buttons, zippers, everything. So clothes were not immediately disposed, but they were reused several times and repaired frequently. And even when they couldn't be used as a piece of apparel, they were transformed into something else, a sleeping bag, or they found some other solution how to use that material without discarding it. So recycling was an integral part of the Soviet lifestyle and engaged family members. Mostly cardboard and newspaper were recycled and collected, but also metal. And there were school campaigns to foster these recycling activities. Glass bottles and jars were not necessarily recycled via these campaigns. They were recycled individually, and most people participated in these recycling activities because the glass bottles and jars were so expensive. Often they were more expensive than what they contained. So there was a very strong economic incentive to recycle. And the separate ministry, the Ministry of Trade, within the Ministry of Trade, a separate section was devoted to the recycling activities because it was considered to be an industry of secondary materials throughout the Soviet period. So they were important raw materials for the economy in most Eastern European countries. Thank you for your attention, and I think we can continue discussions in the breakout rooms.